More. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, a CIA-trained intel operative, Brad Thor, former member of the Homeland Security Department Red Cell Unit, and Laura Rosenberger. She worked on the last two administrations in a national security capacity and on this particular issue. So, Colonel, let me start with you.
Sure.
How significant was it for you when you heard that China said it would remain neutral if there was going to be a conflict between North Korea and the United States?
Well, it's very significant because obviously we're where we're at partly because they've created the situation. They have enabled North Korea to become what it is. And of course, back in 1953, they sided with the North Koreans and actually pushed in, and we fought with against the Chinese. So I think it's very significant. It's not something to dismiss to say it's not important. It's very important. With that said, I don't think it's going far enough. This White House has been trying to reinforce the message, which I think is important to understand, that the Chinese, as much as the South Koreans, would suffer badly, gravely, from any sort of military conflict. So it's in their interest to not simply take a side, but do something to help. And simply put, also, they have other enemies out there should this start firing up. The Vietnamese, the Philippines, India are all enemies, or challengers, if you will, of the Chinese. So I think there could be secondary effects that China has not really calculated. So I think it's in their interest to try to help us to de-escalate this as much as possible.
Yeah, I did think that that was very significant. Brad, I wanted to ask you about your time in the Red Cell Unit, because you worked on a very particular scenario, such as what would happen if the North Koreans were actually going to attack the United States. And I imagine, since that work wasn't too long ago, that the government is actually utilizing those plans to think ahead and to sort of craft its strategy at the moment.
So when I was there, we didn't work on this specific issue of miniaturizing nukes and putting them on ICBMs and getting them here. But with that said, Tony knows this. There are binders after binders after binders that exist on shelves at the Pentagon. What if this happens? Pull it down, open it up. It's been war gamed and everything. I think what we need to realize here is that this is the fault. We are where we are now because of kicking the can down the road. Jimmy Carter kicked the can. In fact, Carter shivved President Clinton in his going around Clinton and doing things he shouldn't have done with North Koreans. But this H.W. Bush, W. Bush, and Barack Obama, they have all kicked it, and we're at the point where you can't kick it anymore. And I think people really need to get behind the president and give him a lot of support in dealing with this, because he's been left with very few options.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And Laura, I would, though, add, it's not as if previous administrations weren't trying some things, and none of those things worked, and North Korea's behavior hadn't changed in terms of the sanctions. What more? But the president just said in his press conference that they're thinking about even tougher sanctions at a very high level. What do you think that means, and what sort of squeeze could be put on the Chinese, I think, or the North Koreans that he's talking about, that would actually affect some sort of behavior change?
Yeah, I think that it's really important that we look at additional sanctions options here, especially in terms of secondary sanctions on the Chinese. There's a lot of money flows through China into North Korea. There's a lot of various components of their ballistic missile programs that come through and from China. It's really important that we crack down on those networks, that sanctions be put in place that penalize Chinese companies, Chinese banks that are facilitators of this. But that has to be part of a larger strategy, and I think it has to be coordinated with whatever's happening under Secretary Tillerson on the diplomatic front. It has to be coordinated with our military posture approach. This has to be a coordinated strategy, of which sanctions are certainly one piece.
Tony, earlier today I read a story in Newsweek about an MIT scientist who thinks that Kim Jong-un is wildly exaggerating his capabilities, but yet we have, I guess, an intel assessment of our own that says, actually, he might be much farther ahead than any of us would ever want.
Dana, look, I've worked this issue since 1992, and I was there. I actually walked the ground in Seoul back in 93, 94, when we first had concerns about the nuclear program. Look, the original nuclear program that we entered into to prevent this, we already knew they had 5 weapons back in 94. Nuclear weapons. So I think the parts of the intelligence community have way underestimated where he's at. And I think I would go with and this is the way I look at it too. You've got to go with the worst case here.
Just assume the worst, right?
You assume the worst, hope for the best. But as Brad said, we've looked at this before, where there's certain new technologies which are being introduced that we have to take seriously. But there's still the threat, as Brad has studied, of the asymmetric threat of the nukes, North Koreans giving a nuke to someone, a terrorist organization, smuggling it in through a container freight, things like that. So no matter how you play it, they've got nuclear weapons. They're trying their best to mounted on some sort of ballistic missile, and therefore, Dana, you've got to basically, as the president's done, say we're going to take very radical action should you try to do anything militarily.
Brad, I want to show you a tweet today from a former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes. He worked for President Obama. He said this. This is a key point. Any chance of a deal with North Korea goes out the window if Trump cancels a nuclear deal that Iran is complying with. You believe that, or basically, that this is the original Iran deal, like what we're looking at right now?
Absolutely. So one thing at a time, all right? Right now, and I really think Ben Rhodes and Susan Rice and anybody else in the Obama administration ought to take a big step back and quiet down for a little bit and let the current administration handle this crisis, because the Obama administration in 2013 was informed by the Defense Intelligence Agency that the North Koreans had miniaturized nukes and were able to get them on top of ICBMs. So for Ben Rhodes to come out and start talking about Iran, this is what's going to happen in Iran. So what's happening in North Korea, this is the exact same thing we're going to see in Iran, where the IAEA can't get into military sites, where they're going to be doing the hardcore development of their nuke program. So that's a problem. So Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, they all ought to zip it and stay out of this. Leave it to the Trump administration. They'll do the right thing.
Let me ask Laura a last question here. The Chinese are looking at a possible party Congress this fall, possibly in November. How important is it for President Xi to have a good conversation with President Trump today, to be cooperative with the United States so that he doesn't have an international crisis to deal with ahead of that meeting of the Communist Party there in China?
Well, the Party Congress in China is extremely important. And in fact, in 2012, as Xi Jinping was actually taking the reins, North Korea engaged in a series of provocations that really rattled the Chinese government, that really got under Xi Jinping's skin. So I think it's really, going to be an important thing for Xi Jinping to be able to have stability heading into the Party Congress. But I think it's also really important that we bear in mind that China's never going to have the same interests that we do vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula. And that means that there's always going to have to be things that we need to be prepared for, that we can't just simply foist onto China. But I do think that there are other really important steps that we need to be taking. And I think that I would just reiterate, this all has to be part of a coordinated approach. What worries me right now is we have different messages coming out of different parts of the administration. That, I think, it leaves a lot of room for miscalculation, and that's my biggest concern.
Although I have a theory that it actually could be all coordinated, but we won't read about it until the history is written. But we'll see.
I have my
Maybe
doubts,
Brad
but
is going to write about this in his next book. Brad will be looking for that. Call your agent. Give me a credit. All right, thank you all. Still to come, should we believe...